All right. Well, tonight's presentation is about the first 100 years of Detroit's Jewish history, 1850 to 1950. And I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce the presenters tonight. As you have probably already noticed, I do have everybody muted because we have quite a large audience tonight. We're going to maintain that throughout the presentation so there aren't any disruptions. If you do have any questions, you can put them in the chat. Most of all of that we're going to try to save for the end of the presentation afterward for a Q&A. But if you have anything like you need a clarification along the way, type it in and we'll try our best to see it and address it as it comes up. We do have to end promptly by 7:30 p.m. So please don't be upset or offended if we don't get to every question or every comment. We'll do our best. And with that, I'm going to introduce tonight's presenters, Robbie Terman and Laura Gottlieb. Robbie is the director of the Leonard N. Simons Jewish Community Archives at the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Detroit. Laura is the director of cultural resources at Temple Beth, where she oversees the Rabbi Leo M. Franklin Archives and Prentis Memorial Library. Together, they are partners in the Joan Meyers Jampel Center for Michigan Jewish Heritage. Both archivists hold a Master of Library and Information Science and certification in Archival Administration from Wayne State University. Together, they like to team up to bring history to life in our community through engaging events, exhibits, lectures, and workshops. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robbie and Laura. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. We're very happy to be here tonight. If you give us just a second, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get our PowerPoint on. Okay, so hopefully by now you should all be seeing our PowerPoint. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for, yeah.
Sorry, right before you go, if you want to do back to the first one in slideshow.
Thank you, Laura.
Great slide, but you'll get there.
Thank you. Yep, I stopped one slide too soon. Okay, let's see if I can get rid of this floating panel. Let's go down. Okay. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. And thank you so much to Detroit Public Library and Megan for inviting us to speak about the Jewish community for Jewish American Heritage Month. So tonight we're going to briefly cover the first 100 years of Detroit. And when I say it's brief, it's because it would take us a lot longer than an hour or a little bit more to talk about the whole history of the Jewish community. So we're just going to give you an overview of the first 10 decades. If you have any questions, as Megan mentioned, you can, of course, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll address it. You also can always email Laura or myself, and our contact information is going to be at the end. So we are going to get going with the presentation.
Awesome. All right, will you go back one slide? Pretty please.
Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, we're there. So starting right with the beginning, there had been.
That was me.
There had, of course, been Jewish people in the state of Michigan now for over 200 years, but we often think of the start of the organized Jewish community really beginning in 1850. And how did that happen? Many German Jewish men, typically men, had left their home country due to restrictions on rights that had caused them to seek a new home and economic promise elsewhere. It was not uncommon for these recent immigrants to become peddlers here in the United States, and then finding connection and opportunity with fellow Germans here in the Midwest, leading them to places like Detroit. In 1850, the population of Detroit was about 21,000. However, unsurprisingly, the Jewish population was a lot smaller than that. In Robert Rockaway's book, Jews of Detroit, he said that in 1850, the city had roughly 51 Jews. So it's a teeny tiny population. For some of these new Detroiters, Michigan was their second or third stop after coming to the United States. And one example of this is Isaac and Sarah Cousins. The Cousins made a home here in Detroit after over a decade already in New York, and they saw there an established Jewish community, and they saw here a lack of an established Jewish community. And so they opened their home on St. Antoine in Congress in September of 1850 to host the very first high holiday services in Detroit. These would have included the holidays Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, which follows 10 days later, the Day of Atonement. And these two holidays are often seen as the highest, holiest days of the year. And so for this small Jewish community just forming roots, it was important for them to have this opportunity to come together. And for the first time, 12 of these German Jews of Detroit officially formed the Bet El Society. Bet El in Hebrew means house of God. This newly formed Jewish congregation became the first in the whole state of Michigan, and we say that with pride. And fortunately for me and many others, it was not a one-time gathering. This Bet El Society continued to grow and is today known as Temple Beth. A place of worship was just one stop in establishing the Jewish community in Detroit. From there, other needs of the community became obvious, including the need to hire a religious leader, a rabbi. In a small community like this, it would be important for a rabbi to have skills that go beyond just leading services and include things like having the training for ritual slaughter, for kosher butchering, for the dietary laws, being potentially a hazan, a cantor, the singer, being able to perform circumcision, all these kind of little life cycle things that would be important for the community, all rolled into one person. The Jewish customs and community then expanded past, of course, this one individual, and the congregation began a Hebrew school to teach these German speakers and some English speakers, also teaching them Hebrew. And they purchased burial land, which is also a classic first step for a young community. And they purchased land in the historic Elmwood Cemetery. And then they created small philanthropy groups. The first one was a special group that would visit the sick. And the Beth El Society officially became legally incorporated in April of 1851. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences within this early Jewish group as far as religious practices. If anyone has any questions, please, again, I'm happy to clarify what I'm talking about. But again, it's a really brief overview. So up until this point, Beth El was what we would call a traditional or Orthodox practicing congregation. That means they upheld a traditional version of Judaism that came with them from Europe. It would have included things like keeping a kosher diet, following the traditions and keeping the Sabbath, the Shabbat, more written out gender roles and separation within the congregation. But at this time in the United States, a new, modern, Americanized, as some called it, version of Judaism was gaining popularity. And throughout its first decade, Beth El had started to align itself with this new movement and even engaged the leadership of the movement, whose name was Isaac Mayer Wise. He was the leader of this new reform movement of Judaism. But it wasn't until the 1860s that this became a solidified, intentional choice to become a reform congregation. Coming to America with German Jews, these early reforms included things like a mixed gender seating and choir, using German or English in the service itself. And these reforms were really groundbreaking. In traditional Judaism, men and women sat in different sections of the congregation and still do. And that would have mean that this reform of having a mixed gender seating or choir was incredibly unorthodox. Services would have been in Hebrew, so using German or English would have, making it more accessible to people who were not fluent in Hebrew was also a drastic change. Isaac Mayer Wise was the first big leader in the American Reform movement and was credited with creating this banner call for the new movement, which is "America is our Zion, Washington our Jerusalem." And there was a really big focus on the idea that this new reform movement was the way in which Judaism was going to make itself American. And it had a lot of pride for patriotism as Jewish Americans. So what does this have to do with Bethel, specifically in the Reform movement? Well, some people in the congregation were in favor of these modernizing changes, and I'm sure this will be shocking, some people disagreed. Yes, so we have our first big community divide. Just 10 years into the established community, Bethel had started to adopt these classic reform changes like the mixed gender choir. And now when there's only one congregation in a small community and two prevalent ways to practice the same religion, there becomes an issue. So the solution was the start of a new congregation that would follow the more traditional Orthodox practice, and we enter Congregation Sheretz Tzedek. The two congregations got along fine as far as we understand today. They were actually located like across the street from each other, and just generally served these two different needs of a growing community. One that wanted to follow the Reform movement, Bethel, and the other for the more traditional practice, Sheretz Tzedek. Today, these two congregations actually are still located near one another out in the suburbs. And because of both of their large and noticeable architectural structures, they even get confused for one another. So today, Sheretz Tzedek serves a conservative Jewish community, which is the third of the three main branches of Judaism in the United States, which is the Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative, which was popularized in the 20th century. But let's get back to Bethel for a moment. It would remain the only Reform congregation in Detroit for the next 8 decades. All the other congregations would have been sprang up as Jewish immigrants came into the city, and they were often, again, traditional or Orthodox, and sometimes would even be more specific to the region that they came from in Europe, so taking on those practices. And Bethel quickly became the hub of Reform Judaism and the home for many German Jews, and truly the main spiritual center for that community, establishing themselves in Detroit. A few of these families, because they were so early, were quickly able to establish themselves and were there for a generation or two by the time the next wave of immigration came. And they had established very successful businesses like clothing stores and cigar stores. And this, I just love, this is a fun way for me to tell a little bit about an actual person who lived in this time and using their voice to talk about life in Jewish Detroit in these early years. And so we look to Lottie Sloman, who was born and raised here in Jewish Detroit. She was born Lottie Teichner and later married Adolf Sloman. And she was born in Detroit in 1857, which is, of course, not long after the community had established itself here. And I find a lot about her in this really cool article written by the Detroit Free Press in 1935. The headline is "Stirring Historical Scenes Related by Detroit Woman. Mrs. Adolf Sloman Tells of Nation's Grief at the Death of Abraham Lincoln," which is just like, you know, it's 1935 and she's looking back, but we're looking back at her looking back, which is just kind of mind-blowing. But the article claims, quote, "Many Detroiters of today know this gracious white-haired woman that you see on the screen, whose early memories are the subject of this paper." And I like how it tells us that the general community, not just the Jewish community, this is the Detroit Free Press, would have known who she was, which I think is really incredible. And to begin, Lottie's telling the story of Detroit during the Civil War era, and specifically, quote, "going with her father and being held on his shoulders to hear Sojourner Truth." And Lottie was young at the time, of course, but she's describing this time where she's walking and going to see Sojourner Truth speak here in Detroit, which is just unbelievable. The article also mentioned that, quote, "though she was small and had to sit on top of the table, she scrapped lint with the others for the hospital during the Civil War," which is something people would do at home to be able to help support the war effort. And the article also describes her talking about how the city really mourned for Lincoln. There was this whole parade through Detroit mourning his death. And the reflections really help us paint a picture of Detroit in general in the 1860s and kind of how this one Jewish individual was really immersed in Detroit life. And I also love to shout out, especially on a talk like this, that her very first job was as a librarian at the Detroit Public Library. I believe she spoke French. She spoke another language, which helped her be a really wonderful reference librarian. So just shout out to DPL.
So shortly after this time period, there was an increasing number of Eastern European Jews, and mainly from Russia, that began to arrive in Detroit. And when I say Russia, it isn't the Russian Empire as we know it today. During this time, Russia could have been a number of countries that we know today. It could have been Poland, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania. There's other ones that I'm not even thinking of, but it was a number of countries that would make up this area that I will often refer to just as Eastern European Jews. So wanting more opportunities and religious freedom, and also leaving behind a lot of anti-Semitism in their home countries, they began to migrate toward America. As the 1870s closed out, Detroit's Jewish population reached 1,000 people, and it was about to explode. So this is a period we know as the Great Migration, which was about a 40-year period between 1880 and 1920. So by 1920, nearly 2 million Jewish people had left Eastern Europe. Of course, not all of them came to Detroit, but in that 40-year span, the number of Jews in Detroit went from 1,000 to 35,000. So that's a huge jump in population. And Detroit was appealing for many reasons, and one of which was the growth of the automobile industry. Although only a small percentage of Jewish people actually worked in the automobile industry, it made Detroit a really growing industrial center, and living conditions here were also very appealing. Unlike cramped tenements in New York City, Detroit had mostly single-family homes. Rent was less expensive here, and there was just more space in general. Eventually, though, many of the immigrants who came here would move into a district that would become very congested and called names like the Ghetto and Little Jerusalem. And this area was known as Hastings. Although non-Jewish Detroiters at first felt sympathy for these Russian immigrants and all they had endured, their support waned as more and more people entered the city. And this only worsened as the Eastern European Jews built a de facto shtetl, a throwback to the home that they had left behind, and with all the necessary elements to cushion the adjustment to a new country. So as I said, this area was referred to as Hastings. We refer to it as Hastings because that main street you'll see going vertical, there's a red line. That was Hastings Street. And it was actually more of an area, it went around Russell, Watson, Brush, and Clinton, with Hastings as that main thoroughfare. As it was said at the time, a Jewish immigrant could spend their entire life in this quarter and never need to leave. All their needs were met. Stores abounded in this area, things like kosher butchers and bakers. There were grocers, clothiers, tailors, and of course, restaurants. Yiddish was the language of choice, and those who worked and lived in the area chose the comfort of familiarity over the option of better and more spacious quarters throughout Detroit. But as more Jewish immigrants came to Detroit, this area became more and more congested. In a 1911 article in the Detroit Free Press titled "Detroit's Ghetto and Its People," the writer describes Hastings like this, quote, "To the outsider, it is a place where unfamiliar tongue is spoken, where congestion makes living conditions almost unbearable, where misery and squalor and suffering abound, a place to be shunned unless you are blessed with the sensibilities that are not too finely attuned and possess olfactory nerves that are proof against assault." Basically saying it smelled really bad. So if you don't want to have a good sense of smell, if you go into this area. It also continued, "To enter its boundaries, to learn of its people and their ways is the equivalent of a journey into a strange land." and seeming to forget that one of the main reasons that the Jewish people came to America and Detroit was because they were leaving a lot of anti-Semitism and hatred in their own country. The article went on to say, outwardly, it is a strange conglomeration of many classes who have flocked to America intent on making a fortune. But of course, that was not the case for many. Many of these Eastern European Jews were Orthodox, and so within a few years, more than a dozen synagogues opened up within walking distance of the Hastings area. The reason it's within walking distance is because during Shabbat, which is sunset Friday through sunset Saturday, Orthodox don't use cars. They would walk to the synagogue, so they needed it close to where they lived. So they had many open up, and it wasn't necessarily about religious requirements, but also about where they came from. So they wanted to worship with the people from their own areas. So they opened up a lot of synagogues that were a Polish shul, and a Hungarian synagogue, and a Romanian synagogue, and a Lithuanian synagogue, and a Russian synagogue, so that they basically, again, were bringing a piece of home with them. And you can see on the picture on the left, that is a 1910 map of the Hastings area. The Jewish stars indicate synagogues. So you can see the huge difference between 1910 and the 1920 on the right. The number of synagogues basically doubles within a 10-year period.
So as more of these Jewish immigrants were coming to Detroit, the well-educated, often German Jews who had been here already for a generation or two and established themselves in the city began to create organizations that would benefit this community, this changing community. And this included things like the Ladies Sewing Circle, Jewish Relief Society, Self-Help Circle, and the Beth El Hebrew Relief Society, which all sound like something similar, and we'll get there. Many of which came out of Temple Beth El or in partnership with Sheretz Tzedek. And each served a purpose of helping new immigrants into American society and helping them find their footing here in Detroit. Some of the new or aid organizations were founded by the newly arrived Eastern European Jews as well. In 1895, an example of this is when 10 Russian men established Gemilut Chasadim, which means acts of loving kindness, which later became known as Hebrew Free Loan. Its purpose was to aid people in a financial emergency with interest-free loans. It provided everyday needs like living expenses and food. It also helped fledgling businesses like peddlers who needed to stock their carts or buy a horse. It would serve other important needs like sending money back to Europe for family in Europe. And many of the earliest loans, they sounded small, but they really would make a huge difference in helping these people to establish themselves, their businesses, and their families. Take, for instance, this one woman who took out a $50 loan so that she could celebrate Passover dinner with a traditional Seder. And she would pay the loan back $1 each week over 50 weeks. So we can imagine just that this religious holiday is so dear to you and you want to host it, that you would spend the entire year paying back a loan for just one meal. But that's the kind of thing that Hebrew Free Loan was able to help people to do to keep their traditions. And Hebrew Free Loan still exists today and is the third oldest free loan society in the country. In 1897, a group of Orthodox Jews founded the House of Shelter, which provided food and shelter for someone who needed aid for a night or two. And by 1899, you hear all these different organizations. There were nearly a dozen different aid organizations, some run by German Jews, others by the Eastern European Jews. And this led to a duplication of efforts and really a shortage of funds if more than one group is doing the same thing and asking for funds from the same people. And so to counter that problem, Rabbi Leo M. Franklin, who had just arrived in 1899 to be the senior rabbi of Temple Beth El, gathered representatives from these different associations and proposed a joint organization through which all the charitable work for the community, the whole Jewish community, could be done. And it was called the United Jewish Charities, or UJC, we might call it. And the first 4 organizations to come under this UJC umbrella were mostly what I just named: the Bethel Hebrew Relief Society, Self-Help Circle, Hebrew Ladies Sewing Society, and the Jewish Relief Society of Shared Tzedek. And this allowed for these different organizations to benefit from the donations giving to one single source, and then out from that into these different agencies, helping to provide their specific service. And it meant people could support the larger community with a single sum donation to the main UJC, and ensure that everyone was taken care of and the allocations were given based on the needs of that year, so they could adjust that when needed. And today, the United Jewish Charities still exists, actually. It's called the Jewish Federation of Metro Detroit. And the UJC is the fundraising arm of that for almost 20 service agencies, which today includes vocational, educational, family, loans, and communal and social work, which sounds very similar to a lot of those agencies that helped build that foundation over 100 years ago.
Early on in its history, the United Jewish Charities was mainly a volunteer-run organization, but it did have a few employees, and so they needed an office. In 1902, a lot was purchased on High Street, which was near Hastings, and a man named Seligman Schloss donated money to go towards the construction of the building as a memorial to his wife, Hannah. The Hannah Schloss Memorial Building was designed by the architect Albert Kahn and opened in 1903. And then in 1908, an addition was added that became known as the Jewish Institute. And you can see in the picture the sign that says the Jewish Institute. The Hannah Schloss was way more than just the offices for the United Jewish Charities. It was really the community's first Jewish community center. In it, it had offices, in addition to the United Jewish Charities, it had Hebrew Free Loan Office. It had another organization called the Industrial Removal Office. It had a library, a room for dances and concerts. So they had ways to socialize. They had social clubs. They had an area consisting of a kitchen, bedroom, and parlor to teach housekeeping skills, because this was also about helping immigrants who had come here recently to Americanize. So they were learning skills that they could then take and get a job with. They had English classes so the immigrants could learn English that would better help them acclimate into the community. They had a nursery for working mothers that they charged just 5 cents a day. And it had bathing facilities because a number of homes in the surrounding area didn't have running water. The tubs were booked in quarter and half hour increments nearly every night that the building was open. Now, Hastings Street actually really no longer exists. The main portion of it was demolished to build a freeway. But just to give you an idea of where that area was, it was sort of near where Ford Field Comerica Park is now. It was pretty close to there in that area of the city.
So with the congestion we're hearing of that this city and its tight quarters where many family lived, these 2 women, Blanche Hart and Ida Koppel, had an idea. They were German Jews who wanted to do something for these new immigrant children. And they were in a new homeland, different language, might have been hungry, maybe didn't have medical care that they needed. So they started this operation that grew, but the first thing they did was to take these kids for a day of fresh air on Belle Isle, and to also give them a hearty meal. And this Fresh Air Society was established, officially organized in 1904. It later became known as Tamarack Camps or Camp Tamarack, and it grew from this outings on Belle Isle into an overnight camp from Venice Beach to Brighton to Ortonville. And today it has a main campus, 2 outpost camps for more rugged experience, as well as a handful of travel trips that take big Greyhound buses across the country into Alaska and explore national parks. Many local Jewish families now, because this was started 120 some years ago, have multi-generational Tamarack campers in their family, and it's a really beloved institution. It also hosts outdoor education programs throughout the year for schools and groups throughout the state. And even with all this expansion of operations, Tamarack still stays true to this essence of its original mission, which was to give Jewish children a chance to be outside in the fresh air with community, regardless of financial ability. And Tamarack prides itself on the incredible amount of scholarship dollars that it offers each summer. And it's leading the country in financial aid to its campers. So it's still doing the work that it set out to do 120 some years ago, but of course in a modern way. And it's still also an agency of the Jewish Federation, so today's UJC, and it benefits hundreds of families each year. So we mentioned Rabbi Franklin briefly helping to establish the UJC in his first year in 1899. And just a few years later, he was so successful in helping to grow Bethel's numbers. Membership was rising, and their building that they had before, which was a church that they had rented, was just not serving the congregation. Enter our friend Albert Kahn, a name I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We've already mentioned him in this presentation, but he was not only a world famous architect, he was also a member of Temple Beth. He belonged there for many years and is even pictured here, the picture on the left. He's a teen in the youth group, and I believe that's a picture from Belle Isle. And it's hard for me to see on my screen, but there's, I think he's seated, and second in from the left is Albert Kahn. And on the back, it actually has his signature, and he wrote to his rabbi. So, but this is his home congregation, and this is the first chance they have to really build a building from the ground up and choose what it's going to be. And so he was commissioned to do that. And this is the building here, also my screen in the background, which is the temple at Woodward and Elliott. And it has this beautiful facade and a recognizable dome top. You might notice it or recognize it today as the Bonsdale Theater, which I believe is in the middle of a construction zone at the moment. But for many years has had that green Wayne State awning in the front. But that is the first Bethel that was really built from the ground up in 1903. The design was influenced by Roman and Greek architecture, you can see with the pillars, with some modern French details borrowed. Albert Kahn had done some travel in Europe and took a lot of inspiration from his travels. In the interior, Kahn aimed at designing something that really expressed the openness and freedom of thought by the Reform Jews. The dedication was September of 1903, and the Free Press described the main auditorium as 2 galleries and arched alcoves with a dome ceiling, of course. The floor was marble and mosaics and woodwork, part mahogany and part birch. The auditorium sat 1,000 people. There were classrooms, a library, social rooms, men and women's parlors, a kitchen, gymnasium, and dressing rooms. And you can hear, similar to the Hannah Schloss building, is the Jewish community really created their own community centers, and that stems some from anti-Semitism, is that these were really the social gathering places. And so for the Beth El community, this was a true gathering space for them. The building was heated by a fan system, and the lighting was electric. The temple was located not so far from that Hastings area we were talking about, a bit more north, but really in the heart of both Jewish Detroit and Detroit itself, right on Woodward there.
So there was still a lot of services that were needed in the community, and one was a free medical clinic. So a free medical clinic was housed at the Hannah Schloss Memorial Building and run under the auspices of the United Jewish Charities. But while it provided for basic medical care, it could not accommodate hospitalization, nor was it really affiliated with a hospital, which proved problematic when it came to a doctor needing to follow up with a patient who had been hospitalized. And it wasn't really as simple as just simply finding a hospital to partner with. Orthodox Jews wanted a place where their beliefs would be respected and where they would be provided with a kosher meal. In 1912, a group of Orthodox Jews marched down Hastings Street carrying signs that said, "Buy a brick to save the sick." And the purpose was to develop a hospital with a kosher kitchen and where Jewish doctors could practice, as often anti-Semitism would keep them from being able to practice at the major hospitals. Of course, the dream of a Jewish hospital did not happen right away. So first came the North End Clinic, which opened in 1926 and served the community for a number of years. It wasn't until 1953 that Sinai Hospital opened its doors and the Jewish community officially had its hospital. And I love this picture on the left. That little baby is the first baby that was born at Sinai Hospital on April 21st, 1953.
Okay, so we've reached the 1920s and a very interesting time for the Jewish community. And you might be thinking, Detroit history, Jewish community, she's about to talk about the Purple Gang. And as fascinating as their history is, and that really is its own whole presentation, we are actually going to focus on the story of Prohibition in a different lens, how it impacted Jews in general, as told through the experience of Rabbi Franklin. And again, this is the same rabbi who's now been here for 20 years in the community at Temple Beth. So he was a leader locally, but also nationwide. He served as the president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and that group was and still is today the governing body of all Reform rabbis in North America. And to make his job a little more fun when he was president, it was during Prohibition. And that would be just a fun fact, except for this little clause in the Volstead Prohibition Act that would make that position as president a very important role. So a little background, the Volstead Act included a sacramental wine clause. And so within the national prohibition law, there were two situations in which someone could make, sell, buy, have alcohol legally, basically. One was through a doctor's prescription that allowed you to get a pint of spirituous liquor for a period of 10 days for medical needs. And the second way was for religious purposes. The idea was that the 18th Amendment shouldn't inhibit your First Amendment rights. So if Jewish people needed to practice Judaism with the use of wine for different rituals, then the new act had to find a way to accommodate that. So this clause allowed for approved rabbis, which is why we are going to care about Rabbi Franklin in a moment, to distribute no more than 10 gallons of wine for religious purposes to every American Jewish family per year. And I did the math on that for us. And if my calculations are correct, it would be roughly 50 bottles of wine per year per family. So that's less than a bottle of wine a week for the whole family. And if you think about someone who's a religious Jewish person, that means every Shabbat is a typical time that you would bless the wine. There's holidays, life cycles. There's plenty of times where blessing the wine happens. That one bottle a week is really not so much. And again, that was the max. But regardless, even with all the hoops that people had to jump through to get to get past the rules and regulations to get the approval, it became obvious that people decided to use this loophole to their advantage, of course. So what did people do? They pretended to be rabbis, some not even Jewish, in order to get wine. And it might sound humorous for us to look back and think about people doing that, but for the time, plenty of rabbis and leaders had a different viewpoint because it wasn't doing so well for the Jewish community. So here is what Rabbi Franklin had to say about this whole situation in 1921. And this is a quote. A considerable number of persons who have called themselves rabbis, though frequently without rabbinical training, have organized congregations and under the law were entitled to secure wine for distribution. As a result of this situation, more than one scandal has arisen, and if the law continues in force, it is entirely likely that there will be further abuses of the privilege. Inevitably, the vast majority of our people who are entirely innocent will suffer shame through the faults of the few who are guilty. And so the CCAR, the governing body of Reform rabbis, decided at one point to petition Congress, trying to rescind that part of the national prohibition law. And Rabbi Franklin himself can be found all over the Detroit Jewish News, talking about how Reform Jews absolutely can use grape juice. We don't need to be using actual fermented wine to do the blessings for religious needs. And that the clause was really causing more harm than solving issues. But regardless of who was for or against the sacramental wine clause, Jews and non-Jews were truly taking advantage of it. Some simply over-exaggerated their numbers, like counting people who had already passed away that year, while other people, like we said, made up entire congregations. And lucrative as it may have been for those, none of this helped with the image that people were really trying to help, because Anti-Semitic rhetoric was on the rise, and articles appeared in the Dearborn Independent that took these stories and twisted them and started then blaming the Jewish people for bootlegging or doing things that that really they were either allowed to do, or that, again, like Rabbi Franklin is saying, just the few were taking advantage of it. And it really just gave anti-Semites ammunition at this point. So it was not good. And so also in this era, just a couple years later, the Jewish community is still growing, now multiple generations in for some, and they become more Americanized and more affluent, and they were moving up Woodward. And they were looking for more space, kind of away from the center of the city, maybe more land. And so they were migrating northwest, and that kind of follows the path of Jewish Detroit really does go kind of northwest through the decades. And so now we're up into the Boston Edison area. And this included, of course, Temple Beth. It was going to be following its members north. And so just 19 years after they built that first building at Woodward and Elliott, they're moving. And this time to Woodward and Gladstone in 1922. This building, also designed by Albert Kahn, had similar elements and style to that previous building. And they described it as a classic structure with seeking simplicity and quiet elegance. It provided room to grow. So last time the sanctuary was 1,000 people seating. This time it was 2,500 people. The school facilities were open for 1,500 children. The assembly hall could seat 900. The dining room could accommodate 700. There was a gymnasium, sewing room, club room, library, roof garden, radio broadcasting. This is all kind of how they reported the building when it first opened. And again, showing that this building was being used as a community center for this group. And it was really a statement. And even now, if you drive by on Woodward and you see the beautiful building now, BCTC, and it's a truly incredible, and it's a real powerhouse of a building, even with its simple elegance. But it's showing that this position of we're here and we're proud, right on that main thoroughfare of Detroit.
As the 1920s comes to a close, just over 50% of the working Jewish population in Detroit was employed in the area of trade, with most falling in the subcategories of wholesale and retail. 26% were classified as proprietors and managers of businesses, things like dry goods, clothing, and junk. And a large portion of scrap metal businesses were owned by Jews. Those that were engaged in professions such as law, medicine, and dentistry made up a good portion of the remaining employment statistics. And perhaps it was because of some of the professional success that it made it appear that Jews were suffering less than non-Jews during the years of the Great Depression. However, the Jewish community faced hardships just like any other group. However, one difference might have been is that we had all those aid organizations that we've already mentioned that were able to step in and assist the people who needed it. The Allied Jewish Campaign, which was and still is to this day, basically the main fundraising campaign of the Jewish Federation before United Jewish Charities. And a lot of the money was allocated in the early 1930s to local relief efforts. They also had the Detroit Jewish Emergency Relief Fund form, which also produced a lot of generous donations, and not just in money, but food, coal, a relief center that had cots, even wine for seders. And on your screen, you'll see some of the documents that were used to solicit money from people. And the right side, the human balance sheet, is going to kind of give you a little bit idea of the people who were in a better position, who were going out and asking people they knew, their friends, other professionals who also were in good shape financially to help and give money to those who needed it. These were some of the reasons that they might have given for why they should help those who are in need. And while the original original intention of the House of Shelter, which we talked about earlier, was to provide food and shelter for Jewish travelers who were just passing through Detroit for maybe 2 days, 3 days, the Depression left so many Detroit's Jewish residents unemployed and homeless that the House of Shelter was very much needed for them. There were crowds of people who had set themselves up in the old Shared Tzedek building, which was at the time at Brush and Willis. They were soliciting food from local Jewish stores. So the House of Shelter offered up its facilities to the Jewish Unemployment Emergency Council and replaced much of their furniture with cots to shelter the homeless. In 1932, the House of Shelter gave shelter to 386 travelers who are just here in the city for a few days, 285 local unemployed, and they also supplied 28,434 meals out of their nearby kosher kitchen. And that's just 1 year of what they did to help the local community. Challenges and hardships, of course, also face the children, some without parents, and some whose parents just simply could not afford to care for them because of the Depression. The Jewish Children's Home was a result of a merger in 1931 between the Detroit Hebrew Orphans Home, which housed children that were under the age of 5, and the Hebrew Orphans Home, which was for children over 5. In 1932, the Children's Placement Bureau had more than 200 children under their care, some with foster families or family relatives, some placed at the Jewish Children's Home. 30% were actually over the age of 15, which at that time, before this, they would have actually been discharged from the program, but because of the Depression, they were kept in the system. These images of kids from the Children's Home, Jewish Children's Home, are from the 1930s, and you can see they're clothed really nicely and all clean clothes. They're taken out to go out for activities. So this was kids that were very well cared for. And then other organizations like Fresh Air Society, which Laura also mentioned earlier, were providing scholarships so these children could also attend summer camp. I think it's actually really interesting to note that the Jewish Children's Home actually closed down in the early 1940s because at that point there were so few Jewish children that needed the children's home. There was just no reason to sustain an entire home. So at that point they closed the home and instead decided to just foster what children still remained. So at this point during the Depression, some of the organizations such as House of Shelter and the Jewish Old Folks Home, which had previously backed away from being affiliated as an agency under the Jewish Federation, had no choice but to come aboard. Without receiving an allocation from that Allied Jewish campaign I mentioned, they just simply could not sustain their mission. As the Jewish Old Folks Home was run by Russian Orthodox Jews, their biggest worry was that Federation, which was mainly still run by Reform Jews, would eliminate the kosher meals. But even with the Depression, that didn't happen, and the organization actually expanded. While Federation funding and donations, a new home was built on Petoskey, which was adjacent to the Children's Home, and the organization was renamed the Jewish Home for the Aged. Personally, I think that was a good choice because the Jewish Old Folks Home always struck me as kind of a mean-sounding name. And we also have some documents that show they referred to the people who lived there as inmates. So yeah, Jewish Home for the Aged seems better to me.
So despite the hardships that the Detroit Jews were facing in the 1930s during the Depression, this population was not immune to what was happening in Europe and allocated money to help with overseas needs, among other aid. But it also raised another issue, and that was the call for a Jewish homeland, and an issue more commonly known as Zionism. During this time, there were a number of prominent Jews who did not support the idea of a Jewish homeland, including Rabbi Franklin. But there were many in the community that were on the other side of the issue. And this would come to head when Rabbi Franklin, who at this point by the 1940s had been the lead of Temple Beth El for over 4 decades. And at this point, Temple Beth El was really a leading congregation in the city. And he decided to retire in 1941. Temple Beth El at that time also had an assistant rabbi who was the head of the religious school program, and his name was Rabbi Leon Fromm. Fromm was hired to Temple Beth El in 1925, and the two rabbis seemingly had a good working relationship, but they had one issue where they differed big, and that was over Zionism. Up until World War II, the Reform movement really stood against the idea of a Jewish state. Their classical Reform rabbis that America is our Zion point of view felt they were practicing an American, modern, and even patriotic version of Judaism. And so this idea of a Jewish homeland went against that. Plus, they saw the formation of a Jewish state as ammunition for anti-Semites who would then be able to point the finger at the Jewish community here and claim they had dual loyalty to this other nation, making them feel less or seem less American than others to other people. But this view was shifting in the 1930s and through to World War II. The realities of the hardships, the discrimination, and eventual genocide of Jews in Europe really changed people's perspective on this issue. And they saw a real need for a safe place, a state of refuge where any Jewish person could live. Rabbi Franklin never really wavered from his classical Reform stance as an anti-Zionist, but Rabbi Fromm, on the other hand, was very progressive for his time. And it was speaking up about this early on, fighting for immigration rights as well. He took up many social causes and used his voice to support a Jewish state. So when it came time for Franklin to retire, he and other leaders at Beth El worked to secure a successor that shared Franklin's views, rather than to elect Fromm as the next senior rabbi, even though he'd already been there for 15 years. The decision actually came to a congregation-wide vote, and they decided not to elect Fromm. And this becomes a big deal for the landscape of Jewish Detroit, because Rabbi Fromm then decided to resign, which we could probably all understand at that point, and formed his own congregation. This new congregation would be only the second Reformed temple in all of Detroit, and it was called Temple Israel. So for those first 90 years of the organized Jewish community, Temple Beth El alone served this entire Reformed Jewish community, which was really growing in Detroit. And now in 1941, Temple Beth El is joined by Temple Israel, led by Rabbi Fromm. The two congregations had a civil relationship. They invited each other to different things, sharing families between them. And today, Temple Israel is in West Bloomfield, and it is one of the largest Reformed congregations in the entire North America. And so it's really this one decision over Zionism completely changed what Jewish Detroit looked like for decades to come. So who was to replace Rabbi Franklin if not Fromm? The congregation unanimously decided to elect Rabbi B. Benedict Glazer, and he too went on to do amazing work in Detroit and was honored after his death with the naming of Glazer Elementary School in the city, which some of you might know.
The end of the 1940s brought with it a historic event that would impact the lives of the Jewish people all over the world, the creation of the State of Israel. The realities of World War II had rallied much of the Jewish population to support a Jewish homeland, allowing for Holocaust survivors and refugees a safe haven when so many other countries, including the United States, had denied them entry. On May 14, 1948, over 20,000 Jewish Detroiters gathered on the field of Central High School to celebrate the founding of this new state. And before we wrap up, we just wanted to do a little fun, did you know about Jewish Detroit businesses? So here are some Jewish businesses that you may not realize were Jewish Detroit businesses. And this includes, but it's not limited to, Velvet Peanut Butter, Fago, Winkleman's, the Siegels, Jacobsons, Himmelhoes, and Farmer Jacks. The 1950s and 1960s would bring about their own changes and challenges to the Detroit Jewish community, and that slowly expanded to include the suburbs. But that will have to be another talk, because tonight's talk is just about the first 100 years of the organized Jewish community. We've talked about people in synagogues, organizations, and community members that helped build and shape the Jewish community that we know today, and some of its influence on the city of Detroit itself. Many of the organization's beautiful buildings and legacies still benefit Detroiters today, Jewish and non-Jewish alike. Thank you so much for having us. And now, if it is okay with Megan, I think we'll do, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat, and we are very happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you guys so much. That was great. And if you do have any questions, please go ahead and bring them through the chat.
Thank you for the thank yous. Those are very nice.
Okay, I saw a question about Izzy Strub. I actually
Yeah.
don't know about Izzy Strub.
I don't either. I haven't heard that name. Let's see here. Were Detroit synagogues connected to regional or national Jewish networks? Yes, typically, like I mentioned, the Reform movement, which established its kind of overarching national organizations in the 1860s and 70s. Temple Beth really right away was affiliated with that. And those organizations still exist, the Union for Reform Judaism, which it's still affiliated with, along with many of the other Reform congregations in the state. The same goes with the conservative movement, also has a governing body. I'm not as familiar with what their terms are, but there are kind of national and international networks of the different denominations of Judaism, typically, is where you'll see how the synagogues are connected.
So can you talk about Bronfmans or the Bronfmans during the Prohibition? Are you guys familiar?
I'm
No.
not. How are you?
I'm not.
I see a question about where was Fromm's synagogue located. It's actually located. It was located in Palmer Park. First, they had services like when they first started. I believe they were meeting at the DIA, and then eventually built the synagogue that's in Palmer Park, and that building still stands today. Right now, of course, it's in West Bloomfield.
A couple questions about the recording. Yes, this is being recorded, and it should be on our YouTube channel, hopefully within the next few weeks.
I see the question of, will we do a program on the Purple Gang? We're happy to do, and we can talk with Megan about doing that. We do a fun history happy hour. Typically, we have an exhibit about the Purple Gang, or really generally Jewish Detroit during Prohibition, which includes information on the Purple Gang. Yeah.
I saw a question about where someone can find pictures of their family's business. It depends. So here's the thing with archives. Archives survive off donations from organizations and people and businesses. So someone really had to donate a picture of your family's business in order for an archive to have it. I can think of a few places that it could be in Detroit, and you mentioned DPL's the Burton collection. That's a great place. So yes, I would check out the Burton Historical Collection, which is within the main branch of Detroit Public Library. I would also check out Detroit Historical Society, which is the body that serves the Detroit Historical Museum. You could also check out Virtual Motor City, which is the Wayne State's online collections. And absolutely try us. You can, feel free to contact Laura and I. If we had anything in our collection, we'll take a look.
Yes, and we do have a digital database, so you can start there, and then if you don't find anything there, we can keep looking. I see a question, and yeah, we don't have to get into the topic of where historically Jews fell on the political spectrum, but everywhere. The answer is really there's all over the political spectrum. And then I also saw that you missed on the Purple Gang and that whole story. This again was a very brief overview. That is why we do a whole other presentation on that topic. It would be very hard to fit everything in here. And then I see also, were Jews prohibited from living in certain neighborhoods? Yes. There were what are the covenants, and there were certain
restrictive covenants.
Restrictive covenants. Thank you.
And Grosse Pointe was one.
Right.
There was a number of neighborhoods. Yes.
And so that is part of why the Jewish community moved kind of the way it did back and forth from from Woodward and up. And then I see a question about our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel is the Center for Michigan Jewish Heritage. We are both from Beth El and from the Jewish Federation of Metro Detroit. I serve as the director of the Archives and Library at Beth El, and Robbie's at Federation. And together we're working under this collaboration of the Joan Meyers Jampel Center for Michigan Jewish Heritage, which is where our digital database and all of our social media comes out of.
And let's see, did we miss?
And did you see the question about where Detroit Jews fell within the historical Michigan political spectrum?
Yeah, that's what I meant. It was on
Okay.
Across the political spectrum.
Okay.
There were, I actually just got a research question not
I
that
just
long
want to
ago.
make sure. Sure.
Where they've been on both Republican, Democrat, both sides, both within within the as representatives, and also just in the community, they fall everywhere.
So there was a mention, let's see, about the relationship between the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews. And yes, it wasn't always rosy in the relationship, because they came at different times. And by the time the Eastern European Jews came on the scene, the German Jews were more affluent and they were able better to give aid. And I think, like anyone who needs to ask for aid from someone, it makes them a little uncomfortable. And so then they start having that feeling of being judged. And that's a little bit of what happened. But we have an incredibly strong Jewish community here, with a very tight-knit relationship between now both the Reform and the Orthodox and conservative Jewish communities here.
And I do want to add to what Robbie's saying that one of the Detroit or Jewish Detroit history books is called Harmony and Dissonance. And it's really reflective of the community, that there's this wonderful, tight-knit, really helpful community. And also there's these divides. And there was that early divide of German Jewish and Eastern European. There was a divide between Reform and Orthodox. But it's kind of this, there's the other, and then there's always, though, this like greater Jewish community. And it kind of ebbs and flows, and things like the Depression, right, brought everyone together. But yeah, oh, you have that book, Harmony and Dissonance. Yes. And Robbie, I'm wondering, someone asked, do you know, the Jewish community did a population study in 2018?
Yes.
I'm wondering if
it's about 71,000 Jews from the 2018 population study.
Yes, the question, so were all the other synagogues Orthodox? Yes, the conservative movement didn't really get popularized until into the 20th century. So before then, it was kind of, you were this Orthodox, more traditional way of practicing Judaism, or it was Reform movement was kind of that first like movement, like an intentional, this is how we're going to practice instead. And then after that came, probably 50 years later, came the conservative movement, which had a reaction to both, saying there's a way that we can do this that makes sense for us. And so, but yes, up until the conservative movement, which I think is 1907. Yeah. That it would have been just this one Reform congregation, and then the Orthodox congregations. Interesting about Reform Jews being against Zionism, is that the case now? Not necessarily. The movement in general supports the formation of the state of Israel. There was different platforms that the Reform movement put out along the way. In the 1880s and 90s, it was like very obviously strictly against the idea of a state of Israel or a Jewish state. At the time, they didn't have a name for it. And then in the 30s, I believe, was when they changed their stance to say, well, people can go there. It can be, you know, we can build up this as a place of Jewish refuge, but maybe not a full state. And then I think by 42, like once World War II was really the realities of what was happening, is when they officially changed their stance to support the idea of a Jewish state. The current population, did you say 71,000?
It's about 71,000. And actually you can, if you go on to jewishdetroit.org, that's the Federation's website. They have all the data from the population study up on their website.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much. And I don't know, Megan, if you have an email you send out, but we're happy to provide our contact. But we're on Facebook, Instagram, Center for Michigan Jewish Heritage. If you type that in, you'll find us. And we're happy to answer any questions, research questions, or anything else.
Yeah, and hopefully we can have you guys come back and maybe do some in-person programming.
Yeah.
About 20th century Jewish history, or about the Purple Gang, since there's a lot of interest in that. And just so everybody knows, we have a lot of both in-person and online programming throughout our big Detroit Public Library system. So please sign up for our newsletters. We send out monthly newsletters about programs that we offer. And we have a really wide array of really enriching programming for all ages. DetroitPublicLibrary.org. And again, thank you for attending tonight. And thank you to Laura and Robbie. Let's just make sure. And we will do hybrid programs. If we do in person, we always try to make sure that they're simulcast on Zoom. And just trying to make sure nobody else has any questions that they'd like to put through the chat. I did see somebody raise their hand. If you want to put a question in the chat, you're welcome to. And wait a second here.
All right.
All right, I think that was actually
Thank you
supposed
so
to just
much.
be a claps, not a hand raise. All right, well, thank you everybody
Thank
so
you
much.
again.
And I
Thank
hope
you.
everyone has a nice evening. Take care.
Take care.